Hello watch enthusiasts! Now as you may know, Baselworld this year was rather different, as the Swatch Group wasn't present, and so we've been waiting their large set of releases for a few months now, and at this point they now have hosted, at least over the past few days, they've hosted their Time to Move event, an event specifically for journalists, but also for sales individuals who will happen to be retailers of the Swatch Group, to be able to see their new releases for the rest of the year. And so this doesn't mark the release of all of the watches that will be released by the Swatch Group this year, but a fair proportion of them. And these releases include a variety of different pieces. From Omega, for example, one sees a new Speedmaster, which, whilst appearing like a limited edition and like many of their other limited editions, I think it's worth taking a second look at this piece. There's also a very impressive set of new vintage-style Blancpains, which I think are beautifully designed and beautifully executed. And also, I was rather impressed by a Jacquet Droz, which I think presents a very interesting reinterpretation of the chronograph. But before I begin the video, I would of course like to encourage you to like, share and subscribe if you do enjoy this video and find the content useful. Also, do follow me on Instagram to be able to access different features and other content which you wouldn't see here on the channel by following the address which is now on the screen for Armand the Watch Guy on Instagram. The first brand I'd like to look at is Omega, and the first piece to speak about is a new variant of the Seamaster 300M. And this isn't the piece which is on the screen at present, because at present you can see the Seamaster 300M, the 42mm version that is, with a new white dial. And this is in addition to the existing range, and I'm not going to speak about it in detail because you know the specifications from my previous videos, but I think it's a nice reinterpretation of the concept, with the same 42mm stainless steel case and the same options in terms of straps and bracelet. However, it should be noted the prices of these watches have risen by about £350 over the last year, so it is interesting to see the transition with these watches now on the bracelet at just under £4,000, which I think does present a new market for them, though I must admit the quality is still superb. But this version has this white dial with these blackened areas on the hands and around the indices, and I think presents a very interesting new option in their range. But in truth, the more important Seamaster to speak about is the new Seamaster 300M chronograph. Now, since the release of the updated line of 300Ms last year, it's unsurprising that Omega have developed the line further into a chronograph as well, as this was an existing model in the range beforehand, so it's unsurprising they added it. And this takes the form of a 44mm piece with a stainless steel case available, or a stainless steel and Sedna Gold version, with a fully Sedna Gold version also available with a very different dial and bezel, but I'll get to that in a moment. They have domed sapphire crystals on the front, of course with Omega's specific anti-reflective treatment on the inside and the outside of the crystal, which has become very well known for giving extremely high legibility, and of course have ceramic bezels with, for most of the models in the range, an enamelled surface in the same way as the normal watch has, to prevent it from fading over time, but also to make the markers much more scratch resistant than they were on previous versions of these ceramic bezels. Of course, you do still have the cap over the small luminous pip at 12 o'clock, but the dial is a real area of reform for this watch. As whilst 44mm is by no means a large size for a Seamaster 300M chronograph, as we've seen this size before, they've made very good use of the dial on this particular watch, as this version maintains the updated wave patterns seen on other versions of the range, with these laser engraved waves across the dial, except now, thanks to the use of a much more advanced movement, they've been able to give it this bicompax layout instead of the quite cluttered dial seen on previous iterations. And this means that this watch simply has these two subdials, which are sunken into the dial itself, which is ceramic, in order to give this extra depth, but I think works extremely well to not make the chronograph overly overpowering in terms of the amount of details on the dial, with the small seconds for the time on the left, and on the right a single subdial with two hands operating the minutes and the hours of the chronograph, and of course the date in a matching colour to the dial at 6 o'clock. The hands remain very much the same as the models on the three-hand versions, and I think retain the elegance that one would expect from this watch, although at 44mm in size, I think that perhaps these wider hands are more suited to this watch than the slightly smaller 42mm version, though of course that's purely opinion. And really the interesting aspect about the case of this watch is that we see redesigned pushers on this watch especially. On previous versions they have had coloured pushers, and of course the pushers on these watches are built to resist water in terms of their use, which is a rare feature on a dive watch. Except on this piece they've decided to make them entirely out of ceramic on their top, and I must admit I'm not entirely taken by this idea, on the basis that these pushers are non-guarded and thus will be subject to knocks, and bear in mind that ceramic is not the most shock-resistant of materials, certainly no comparison to steel, I would worry about cracking one of these if it were to be bumped very hard, which would have a major effect on the water resistance of the watch. Of course, there are some differences between the steel version and the two-tone version and the fully Sedna Gold model, because the fully gold model comes with a different bezel design, where the bezel is raised and textured in ceramic as well, but without the same style of markings, and the dial has an inverted pattern. So instead of seeing this laser etching engraving these waves into the dial itself, those are raised somewhat, as well as having some additional details on the dial, with a chapter ring in addition to the standard ceramic base, which certainly is to be expected for the more expensive model, but I think fits with the design rather well, although I must admit that I do prefer the blue steel version, for example, to the rather ostentatious gold model. And so whilst these models were by no means unexpected additions to the range, I think they're reasonably competitively priced, with prices starting at 6,600 Swiss francs for the steel version on a rubber strap, and then going all the way up to 24,000 Swiss francs for the solid gold model. But I think considering the technology going into them, and the fact there is a real market for these chronograph versions of dive watches, I think they'll sell very well. Of course, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, and naturally Omega has already marked this with their solid gold version of the Speedmaster as an almost direct commemoration and remake of their golden version produced in the late 60s to commemorate this particular event. However, the piece which I'd like to speak about today is another run in this limited edition of watches produced across the year, and it's the first version we've seen in steel, although this version is in two-tone gold, you could say, with a steel case and a gold bezel. And it's very easy to dismiss this watch as just another one of these large production scale models from Omega which are presented as a limited edition. However, upon closer inspection and thought, I think this watch is something very different, so do tell me what you think about it once I've finished. The presentation of the watch is, I think, excellent, because one has this box with a number of badges it comes with, and a number of accessories, including quite an interesting strap, which I'll talk about in a moment. But it also sits on this Moonlander-shaped cushion, which I think is a nice touch, although of course these are gimmicks in the purchase. I think they are nice to see around this watch, which does cost a considerable amount of money. But the watch itself follows very similar lines to the normal Speedmaster Professional, so 42mm case, manually wound movement, and this tri-compax layout for the dial with no date. But apart from that, a great deal has changed. One has a stainless steel case, of course, but the bezel features an 18-karat gold rim, except they use moonshine gold, which is their particular alloy, which allows you to have this lighter colour of yellow gold, which I think is much more subtle and tasteful than normal yellow gold. Also, you have a ceramic bezel on this watch instead of the normal aluminium one, and one aspect which I don't think has been noted particularly is the fact that it does have a dot over 90 bezel, which I think is an interesting touch, which is a collectible aspect and a collectible feature on vintage bezels for Speedmasters, so it's nice to see this remade and included on this modern version. The dial has also been profoundly redesigned, and I must say looks excellent to my eye at least, with this almost JPS style livery with the gold, the black and the grey. And so you see the centre of the dial with this grey colour to it which appears somewhat like the surface of the moon, and then around its edge this black area which features the markers for the minutes and the seconds, but also features a golden colour text, which I think works very well and matches the fact that the indices as well as the Omega logo and the hands are made out of 18-karat moonshine gold. There is one proviso to this though, which is that the second hand is brass rather than being gold, because of the fact that it has to be lighter to be able to jump back to zero when you reset the chronograph. Somewhat more obvious hints towards the ideas behind this watch are seen in the fact that one has an applied gold logo for Omega, and this is a logo which resembles very closely the logos seen on original 321 caliber Speedmasters, such as those worn by the Apollo 11 astronauts. Also, these watches feature an 11 in Arabic numerals placed at the 11th marker, instead of a normal index, to be able to symbolise that moon landing. But also on the left-hand side of the dial, one sees underneath the small seconds a black and gold plate with an engraving of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder of the moon lander. The watch also comes out of the box with a steel bracelet which is inspired by the ones used in the 1960s on Speedmasters, with more narrow links and also a different clasp, but also one has a cork strap which is coloured black to resemble the heat cladding on the command module of Apollo 11. And I think the case back makes this watch a very interesting piece as well, because aside from having the engraving on the back on this textured surface with the astronaut's boot, which I think is appealing but isn't particularly historically interesting, really it's what's happening technologically on the case back that's particularly interesting. because rather than having a normal screw-on caseback, this is the first Speedmaster Professional of this sort to have a Naiad caseback, and we've seen these on the Aquaterras, for example, and the Seamasters, where these watches have casebacks which lock in instead of screwing in, meaning that you always have them aligned vertically. Also, the movement inside this watch is brand new to a steel Speedmaster, and is the 3861, an evolution of the famed 1861. And whilst it doesn't have the column wheel which is so loved on the 321 caliber of older Speedmasters, it does have a free-sprung and weighted balance, in addition to a silicon balance spring, and is anti-magnetic to 15,000 Gauss, with a chronometer rating as well, which is crucial to making this watch a real change for the manually wound range of Speedmasters. Also, it does feature a 50-hour power reserve, 26 joules, and runs at 3 Hz. It is also decorated with Geneva stripes and anglage, and crucially this watch is also hacking, which has been a feature absent from previous Speedmaster Professionals. And so whilst the price for this watch of 8,900 Swiss francs is by no means cheap, I think that considering the fact that this watch is an important model in the evolution of the Speedmaster Professional, it shouldn't be dismissed in the same way as their other large number productions of limited editions. Because it's true that Omega have gained a certain bad reputation for producing these 7,000-piece limited editions, which don't really feel like limited editions, yet their prices still soar because of that sort of name as being a limited edition. But I think this piece is one to pay attention to because it's not really like the rest as far as these limited editions go. The next piece to speak about is a new chronograph from Jacquet Droz, which I think presents a very interesting option if you want a luxury chronograph which is automatic and has a very interesting operation and display. Now, there are actually two versions of this watch being released, one limited edition and one which isn't a limited edition. Technically they are the same, except that the limited edition version is gold, but also features a vertical orientation to the subdials on the dial, and the crown is at 3 o'clock. It's the more elegant and the more dressy, if you will, of the lot, but I think doesn't have quite the variety and the individuality of the standard production version, which comes in steel. But in truth, it's the standard production version which I'm more interested to speak about today, because this piece comes in stainless steel and represents a very high-end luxury chronograph of the automatic variety, which makes a very interesting alternative to something like a gold Rolex Daytona, for instance, and considering the fact that this watch is a far less well-known piece, will more likely be a more rare and individual option for that sort of price range. And the piece comes in stainless steel with this rather large 43mm by 14.83mm thick case. And this may seem rather overbearing for a watch of this simple variety in terms of the dial display and the more dressy format, but I think it wears its size very, very well. And this is finished in polished stainless steel to give you this luster to the surface of the case, and of course the main attraction to this watch is that dial. Because looking at the front of the watch, you're able to see through this sapphire crystal, which is subtly domed in a modern way, which matches the exhibition caseback as well, under which you can see this dial, which truly is unique. The dial arrangement is really quite beautiful, with 3 colours available. There's a blue version with rhodium hands, an anthracite dark grey colour with also those rhodium hands, and a more classically correct silver with blued hands. But all of these share the same arrangement and configuration, of course, because they share the same movement. And these are rooted around the idea of these watches being an elegant monopusher chronograph. That's to say, a single pusher controls the start, stop, and reset of the chronograph, being a more simple arrangement. And the dial features these hours and minutes placed on their own subdial at the 12 o'clock position in relation to the crown, so that ends up being around the 1 o'clock position. Also, this sits right beside, admittedly on the opposite side of the dial, the other subdial, which has a coaxial arrangement, so one has 2 aspects displayed on it, with the minutes of the chronograph displayed on this 30-minute counter, in addition to a hand which separately runs the date, and this acts as a retrograde hand, which means that once it hits 31, it jumps back to 1 rather than continuing around the circle, which is an interesting touch which you don't notice first of all, but really becomes more apparent when you inspect the watch. Also, the seconds for the chronograph are centrally mounted to give you that high legibility which you would expect, and also demonstrate that this watch is first and foremost a chronograph. And the movement inside this watch is the beautifully decorated 26M5R, and this is loosely related to the Frédéric Piguet 1185, a very high-end movement it must be said, with automatic winding and the chronograph, although of course it's been reconfigured quite completely on the top half to be able to display this particular arrangement with the time as well as the date and the chronograph all being separated. It has a 40-hour power reserve, a silicon balance spring, and also silicon pallet horns to be able to allow greater longevity on the escapement, and also have a certain effect on the anti-magnetism of the watch. And this watch runs at 3 Hz, so that's to say 21,600 vibrations per hour, which is an attractive beat rate for these watches. It does give you a slightly more obvious tick than you would see on some other chronograph movements, but nonetheless shouldn't be any sort of problem. And of course it is automatic, so you have this 18-karat red gold rotor rotating around the inside of the case back, which has been skeletonized to allow you to have a better view of the beautifully decorated movement. Crucially, this watch also has a column wheel, which allows the watch to have a much more crisp engagement and adjustment of the chronograph, rather than you would have with a cam, which is something to be expected at this sort of price range. And of course, at the price of 20,000 Swiss francs, it won't be a watch for everyone, but I think to those to whom this watch does appeal, it really will be quite a marvel, with a historically interesting movement, and also a very well engineered package as a whole, with beautiful quality and a generally fantastic design. Where Blancpain was concerned this year, we've seen 2 really fascinating sports watches from the brand, which have stood out amongst their releases for me. And the first, and I think the real highlight for the vast majority of people, will be the Blancpain Air Command Flyback chronograph. Now this piece is based on a model produced in only about 12 examples for the American Air Force, and the reasons for the production of this watch are very limited, because in terms of documentation there is nothing existing regarding the creation of these chronographs in the 1950s. And all we know really is from the examples which do currently exist, and these feature the Veligeau 222, which was a flyback movement similar to those used in the Type 20 watches for the French Armée de l'Air. And this watch does take a format which was very similar to that of those Breguet Type 20s, with the rotating bezel, as well as that bicompact layout and those luminous dials. But whilst we know very little about the origins of this watch, it is unsurprising they would be made for the US military, considering their involvement, which was pre-existing, with the 50 Fathoms being sold by Allen V. Tornek to the US Navy. But the modern iteration of this watch is rather different, because whilst it maintains very similar aesthetics and also very similar dimensions to the original, it is a comprehensively modern watch. We see a 42.5mm case, which is 13.77mm thick, and even purists should find this a reasonable size since it's not too dissimilar from the 42mm of the original. There is also an extra amount of detailing on this watch with different finishes, but also the fact that this case in stainless steel features enlarged bevels running down its edges and a slightly redesigned grip on the bezel, which makes the watch appear both modern but also very vintage in its inspiration, and has a 3 ATM water resistance. What's perhaps most interesting about this watch is that the aesthetics have been taken very, very closely from the original, as opposed to, for example, the Blancpain 50 Fathoms, which takes a few liberties with the original design. Because this piece features those narrow lugs, but also if you look at the front of the watch, it features the bezel seen on the original, with the diamond shape at 12 o'clock, and these markers every 5 minutes. And it does feature old radium lume on a ceramic bezel insert, with these very fine grips on the edge of the bezel to make it more delicate, whilst in the centre of the dial one sees this domed style of sapphire crystal to give a box shape not too dissimilar to the original plexiglass used on the original watch. Under this one sees a dial which also follows the original very, very closely, with these luminous, again old radium coloured styles of Arabic numerals, and this bicompact layout, and I'm glad they've refrained from adding a date, which I think would have spoilt the design somewhat. There have been some adjustments, of course, where the hands have been shaped slightly differently, and in some areas the tachymeter, for example, is now much more cleanly displayed, as on the original. These subdials actually ate into the rim of the markings on the dial, which would have made a problem for legibility, which has been corrected with this piece. And so in many ways this is what the original should have been like in terms of being a more clean version, and a version which perhaps works better to the eye. And so whilst this watch is certainly a remake of the original, I think they've done a very, very good job of amalgamating this with a modern format. So the size of the watch, of course, was already conducive to this design, but also the fact they haven't messed with the design too much, which is so often the case when watches are reissued. And so I'm very glad to see the fact they haven't done so with this piece, apart from the technical additions of a new movement, as well as a sapphire crystal and a ceramic bezel, and of course a general re-engineering of it, including a new crown. But the movement inside this watch, visible through the exhibition case pack, is the biggest departure, I'd say, from the original. Because we see the caliber F388B, which I think is a fantastic choice of movement, and like that Jacquet Droz, is based on the Frédéric Piguet 1185. Instead, though, of going for the arrangement of the Jacquet Droz, they've gone for something somewhat more ambitious. It runs at 5 Hz in this piece rather than 3, giving you this 36,000 vibration per hour movement, giving you 10 ticks per second, and a very, very smooth run to the seconds. As well as this, you get a vertical clutch and a column wheel, which are fantastic aspects to a chronograph to be able to give a more efficient powertrain for the chronograph to run off, but also to give better engagement with that column wheel. And the use of a silicon balance spring is certainly an accepted addition to this watch that you would expect on a watch of this price in this day and age. But also this watch has a flyback function like the original, to be able to make the seconds jump back to zero and then restart with a single press of that bottom pusher, which I think was a great choice. But the real pièce de résistance of this movement is the 18-karat red-gold propeller-shaped rotor on the back, which winds this watch's 50 hours of power reserve and gives you a beautiful view through the caseback. And so whilst this piece is certainly not cheap at 18,500 Swiss francs and being produced in 500 pieces, I think the fact that this watch is a unique recreation of a vintage watch will make this piece, I think, a very successful model, and irrespective of the high price, I'm certain these will sell extremely well, and I think really are the highlight from Blancpain. However, there is one other watch released which comes from the 50 Fathoms range, which has also caught my eye. The second piece from Blancpain which I'd like to speak about, albeit in slightly less detail because it's a piece which is based on existing models in the Blancpain range, is the Blancpain 50 Fathoms Barakuda. Now, they have in fact released two new 50 Fathoms, with one being a version to commemorate the very early 1950s models, whilst this piece commemorates slightly later models produced under certain interesting circumstances. And whilst the version which I'm not going to speak about in this video has a design which is very similar to other pieces in the range and is more of a nod to history rather than a sort of celebration of it, I think this piece, the Barakuda, is a really fascinating example. Because the piece takes the same 40.3mm case of the 50 Fathoms mil-spec seen in previous years, which I must say looked fantastic, and it's 13.32mm thick with a 300m water resistance, as is predictable for a dive watch of this type, and of course is stainless steel and is fully polished to give it this very lustrous look which is so typical of the 50 Fathoms. However, some elements which have changed are seen first of all in the bezel, because the bezel of this watch has these fine knurlings and grips which are much more delicate than other 50 Fathoms. I think look absolutely superb on this watch, especially paired with that domed sapphire bezel insert, which is luminous and has this old radium style lume inserted into it to give this, this slight translucence to the surface of it, but also a very strong glow in the dark. Then one has to look at the front of the watch to be able to see further differences, because the dial of this watch is particularly inspired by models which were sold by the German diving company Barakuda to the German Bundesmarine, as well as a civilian version which was also available during that period when these watches were military equipment. And whilst the original had a very different case to this piece in terms of being smaller and also more narrow-lugged, this piece does recreate that dial, which was very famous for having the date at 3, but also having these red elements around it and slightly thicker, more squared indices as opposed to the diamond shape we're used to from Blancpain. And this aspect of the watch has been recreated really perfectly for this piece, with that aged luminova, but also those white military hands and the red components and elements on the dial, with simply Blancpain 50 Fathoms and Automatique not putting too much text there either. And the white date, I think, is a nice touch, thanks to the use of that white rim around the date window. Through the exhibition caseback, one can see the caliber 1151, an automatic movement from Blancpain, which provides a 3 Hz beat rate with a 100-hour power reserve, and of course automatic winding via this blackened rotor. And as is to be expected with Blancpain, it's decorated beautifully, with a great deal of interesting finishing on the surfaces throughout the visible areas of the movement, and certainly represents Blancpain as a high horology brand which is producing a sports watch rather than vice versa, being a sports watch brand that has delved into high horology. And so the price of this watch is 14,500 Swiss francs, being produced in 500 pieces, and whilst it's nothing groundbreaking, it's nice to see Blancpain continue to expand their range of watches which commemorate older models in their range and which recreate these rather amusing touches on their existing models and adding details which will really appeal to the collector. The final piece I'd like to speak about is a beautiful redesign of an existing model from Breguet, and this is the Breguet Classique Tourbillon Extra-Plat Squelette, which is a skeletonized version of their 41mm by 7.7mm thick Classique Tourbillon Extra-Plat, which is their ultra-thin automatic tourbillon dress watch. And so the watch comes in either 18-karat pink gold or platinum, depending upon what you find more appealing, and so it is based on that 2017 watch, but now with a fully skeletonized dial and caseback, with approximately 50% of the movement being removed as a result of this skeletonization, leaving large areas to see straight through the watch. And the watch features this beautiful sapphire crystal, which approaches the more vintage side of things, because it's not the normal flat sapphire you might see on other Breguets, but rather is a bubble domed style of sapphire to be able to give you a better view into the dial. And the dial of this watch is not really existent anymore. Instead, there's this plate of sapphire crystal underneath the crystal itself, which allows the hobnail effect markers for every 5 minutes to be applied, in addition to the Roman numerals painted, as well as the minute track. And so it really is with this care that Breguet have been able to make a skeletonized watch still usable, which is often a concern with this style of timepiece. But aside from the typical Breguet touches with those heat-blued hands, and the beautiful style of case with these flat sides and these rolled metal edges, it really is the movement which one has to speak about. And the movement inside this watch is the 581 SQ, an 80-hour power reserve watch running at 4 Hz with this 1-minute tourbillon. And the watch provides a silicon escape wheel and balance spring to give a certain anti-magnetism and resistance to the watch, in addition to a titanium tourbillon cage, which is for low weight in order to increase the power reserve and generally allow the watch to run at this higher beat rate of 4 Hz as well. And the whole thing is decorated with exquisite care, with anglage around edges, with these beveled edges, as well as decoration throughout, whether it's engine turning or these engraved elements on the surface of the movement, which are all done by hand or with appropriate machinery operated by hand, showing this remarkable display of craftsmanship, which really is what this watch demonstrates, as it's not a groundbreaking piece in terms of design, but just a beautiful example of skeletonization. And really the pièce de résistance here is the peripheral automatic rotor for the automatic winding, which means that rather than having a thick and also highly visible automatic rotor, you have a piece of metal which rotates around the very edge of the movement, still visible but not obstructing or obscuring the movement at all, to wind this watch automatically. And the price for this watch is suitably high and predictably high, being 220,000 Swiss francs for the gold version and 235,000 for the platinum. But either way, it's a beautiful piece to look at and just to drink in as a piece of exquisite craftsmanship. And so I'll conclude this video here, but I'll be fascinated to hear what you have to say about these various watches and the concept of the Swatch Group no longer being at Baselworld, for example, instead having their own display of new pieces and their own releases of these new pieces at a different time. Because I must admit my opinion has changed somewhat, because whilst admittedly this doesn't allow the vast majority of journalists or public to see these watches immediately, it does mean that the Baselworld period isn't overwhelmed with new watches, many of which pass under the radar as a result of the sheer volume of pieces being released at the same time. So it does seem to be a double-edged blade here. So I'll be curious to hear what you have to say. And if you enjoyed this video, then do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in the future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, out.